two sort of divine avatar beings that came to me. And it was this beautiful experience where there was a sort of it wasn't linear. It was like a packets of knowledge. It lasted for I don't know how long. That was really the sort of packets of the next 500,000 years of this cycle coming that happened. And so at a certain point, they said, do you want to come with us or go back to the earth? And they gave me a choice. And I said, well, sort of thy will be done. I said, well, what would you want me to do? They said, we want you to go back, which with that, I was not happy because this was such a state of joy and bliss and beauty that I did not want to come back to this dust heap of a world where I'd had a horrible childhood, by the way. So I said, oh no, I'm okay. But I acceded, and then boom, went back into my body. And for a little while, I was sort of being induced to leave again, just test my will to live. And it happened 4 or 5 times.
Welcome to the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. The podcast is dedicated to conscious souls looking to change the world. Astrologer by day, climate activist by night. Here is your host, Debra Silverman.
I always say this, it's my personality type. I'm so excited, but I'm so excited. So let me make a distinction. I'm like super excited today to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Greer. I did find his material years and years ago. I want to say during Disclosure, that must have been, was that like 7 or 8 years ago that film came out?
Unacknowledged came out.
Unacknowledged.
Yes, and it's still available. In fact, it's still #1 on Amazon Prime in 2017, so 5 years ago.
Okay, 5 years ago. And I did take a dive then, but what happened just recently in finding your recent film, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, I'm now a little obsessed. I've got it all over my Instagram this upcoming week as we lead in. And I want to just say straight up, I am going to the event we're going to discuss. I want to make it really clear that there's an invitation to this podcast. It's not the normal podcast. It's a far more purpose-driven podcast in that there is something specific that I personally have been called to do that happens to coincide with Dr. Stephen, which I have never met him before. So you need to all know that. And it has been a very strong calling in my deepest heart of hearts that we're sitting here today. So let's begin with the name of the podcast is the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. Dr. Stephen Greer does not know astrology, didn't know his birth time. So I love that, the innocence of that. And if you would just begin by self-describing what you've been doing over these last 40 some years.
Yes, well, I'm an emergency and trauma doctor, a medical doctor. But some years ago, I found out that we weren't alone in the universe and started a project in 1990 to start a citizens diplomacy corps, similar to Physicians for Social Responsibility that sent doctors over to the old Soviet Union during the heights of the Cold War to make peaceful contact with these civilizations that are visiting the Earth and that we have proven are here. And of course, now it's all coming out through the Pentagon and the US government, which is what we've been working on. But the really heart and soul of what we've been working on has to do with what we're going to be doing out in Arizona, September 16th, 17th, 18th. And that is having mass consciousness sync up in this sort of resonant field where we make contact with these civilizations as ambassadors from humanity to them, to sort of offset the militarism and negativity that has dominated this subject. So that's called CE5 Contact. It stands for Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. So there's really 3 big projects that we're doing. Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, which is when humans initiate contact with interstellar extraterrestrial civilizations, which gets into some astrology, I guess, and certainly astrophysics, but some astrology too, because it's all a conscious field. And then secondly, and we just call that CE5 Contact. And by the way, there's an app that's in the top 5 educational apps in the world for 2 years now called CE5 Contact. So you can actually be trained to do this. Then the other project, which was interestingly an outgrowth of that, was the Disclosure Project, where I was asked in '93 to come up here to Washington and brief the director of the CIA for Bill Clinton and all these other people on the ET and UFO issue, because they knew that I had collected a huge archive of material. And when the president, the CIA director, asked about the subject, they were told, buzz off, we're not telling you anything, which is still the situation to this day, unfortunately. This is why I have a place in Washington and a farm out near the University of Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains where I hide. Anyway, so
said the cancer.
Yeah. And then the third part of it was when I discovered the sort of one of the core reasons for the secrecy is that the technologies behind how those things move. I tell people, just forget all the emotionally laden terminology about aliens and this and that. Those are alternative energy and propulsion systems, which means for the last almost 100 years, we have not needed oil, gas, coal, nuclear power. The reason that's so important is that we're destroying Gaia, the biosphere, for no good reason except greed, corruption, and a massive global control drama by fascistic industrial and government entities that don't want us to be free of the yoke of the way that we're running the planet on fossil fuels. And by the way, these technologies that are related to how those objects move way beyond solar and wind, my friend. I mean, you could have something that would fit on a 2x2 table that would run Denver, all right? And with no pollution and no radiation. So these technologies are earth-saving and humanity-saving technologies, but they're secret for the same old reasons. Many things have been kept secret, and that's just plain old greed and corruption. So those are the three big projects that I head up.
Okay.
Are those three.
I want to do a couple of things. One is I was so fascinated by the 8-year-old who saw the first spaceship and was with his sister, and that was inspiring. And then the 17-year-old near-death experience. And then that brings us astrologically to 1960s, 61, 62. Saturn was in Aquarius. In 1991, 92, Saturn was in Aquarius. 21 and 22, Saturn's in Aquarius. Astrologically, I'm going to show you this. There have been 3 eras that you have been really predominantly influenced when the astrological influences have been in your favor. But before we go cosmic, I want to come back to the earth because I am a therapist and the 8-year-old little boy. So if you could just take us, because this is what brought your human dimension into this conversation.
Right. Well, it is. I grew up in the South in a very poor family. We lived in a 2-room shack with no air conditioning and no central heat.
How many kids?
There were 4 kids and 2 parents, so there were 6 of us in this shack. I put myself through high school, college, and medical school. Everybody thinks I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, and I'm not ashamed of it at all. But my twin sister, who's 3 minutes older than me, by the way, and I were out in our yard. And this was when it would have been in the early 60s. And I was with some neighborhood boys.
Saturn wasn't, I just want to note, Saturn was an Aquarius. And every time you mention a significant marker, it's astrologically described, but I don't want to go there to complicate. So let's go back. So it's early 60s.
And so it's broad daylight. And we look up and there's this seamless, no parts, just a perfectly seamless silver sort of disc that was in the sky hovering, and it didn't fly in, it materialized. That boom was there. So my sister and I looked at it, and these boys, and we went, wow, that's a flying saucer, I think is what they were called back then. So we were, from that point on, it sort of opened up a curiosity in me that would not go away for my whole life. So of course our parents said that we were making it up, et cetera, and so on, but we know what we saw, and it was very 3D and very much here. And so I began to collect, it's very funny, as a little boy, the old magazines back then in the 60s, like Argosy and True, that had on the cover pictures of UFOs that people were getting all over the world. And I had like a 3-foot stack of them in the back of my closet, hidden away, that I was collecting and was obsessed with it. So that's when that's little boy Stevie. I was called so Stevie.
Destiny came in, Stevie got his activation. And I'm going to just tell you something. In 1962 to 63, for the first time ever and never since, there were 6 planets in Aquarius, which describes the 60s. This radical departure from our
Mhm.
old society. Aquarius sign that cannot follow. This is very strong in your
Mhm.
chart. I don't know how you got to
Mhm.
be a doctor. They have a really hard time following the rules and doing what's expected, and they go outside this reality to include the future.
Right.
So
Well, even as a doctor, I was always the renegade because I finished college at 19, and then I went and became a meditation teacher of the Vedas and Sanskrit, and went all over the world setting up meditation centers, and then went into medical school, which was a pretty radical thing to do when I went in back in the 70s. But
So what I want you to hear is Destiny's had her way with you. And while the mind of yours, which is quite active, hasn't included the astrological, my desire is to give you yet another language to see how perfectly positioned and that there's this magical influence that occurs. And that's why I want to continue. So now that, because I'm very fascinated and have read everything about near death. So at 17, you described an illness. I never heard what it was you had.
Well, I had an injury to my left thigh muscle on the lateral, the outside part of it, and being a jock boy, and also, how teenage boys are. They think they're indestructible. It had my own little apartment in high school. And I decided to bicycle from Charlotte all the way to the North Carolina coast, 200 miles in one day with this injury, but it got terribly infected. And then I bicycled 200 miles back a few days later. Well, by then I was so sick and we were so poor, we had no health insurance. I was washing pots and pans at a Red Lobster, trying to support myself in high school and also my sisters. I didn't see a doctor and I got sicker and sicker and sicker. So I became septic and then my kidneys and liver shut down. So I'm by myself in this little studio apartment in Charlotte at age 16, I guess, 17. It was 1973. And I had a near-death experience and I went out. But when I went out, because I was not raised in a religious family, my great love was always the earth, nature, the stars, and space, always, since I was my earliest memories. So I went right out into the depths of space and had a cosmic consciousness experience and a oneness experience. And at that time, I also met these two sort of divine avatar beings that came to me. And it was this beautiful experience where there was a sort of it wasn't linear. It was like a packets of knowledge. It lasted for I don't know how long. That was really the sort of packets of the next 500,000 years of this cycle coming that happened. And so at a certain point, they said, do you want to come with us or go back to the earth? And they gave me a choice. And I said, well, sort of thy will be done. I said, well, what would you want me to do? They said, we want you to go back, which with that, I was not happy because this was such a state of joy and bliss and beauty that I did not want to come back to this dust heap of a world where I'd had a horrible childhood, by the way. So I said, oh no, I'm okay. But I acceded and then boom, went back into my body. And for a little while, I was sort of being induced to leave again, just test my will to live. And it happened 4 or 5 times. And I finally nailed it. And then I realized, oh my God, I'm paralyzed. Initially, I was out so long, I think, that I couldn't move my physical body, but my sensory input was there. So I literally could hear, and I could even see the tree and the light moving outside my window wee hours of the morning, but I couldn't move my physical body. It was like a post out of body paralysis. But at age 17, I just thought I was going to be paralyzed. I said, oh, great. Now I'm back on this planet and I'm paralyzed. But eventually all that came back, all my function. So I got up and my fever, I had 105-degree temperature. My fever broke, the infection healed. I still have part of my thigh muscle missing on my left leg, sort of an indented area that got eaten up by the infection. But I never saw a doctor. I mean, so I never did get any medical help. So I also had a spontaneous healing of what I now as a doctor understand to be a very lethal medical condition.
And then that drove you to meditation. So you had this access, which all near-death experiences that I've read and done a lot, I've had my own experience. It's so tempting to stay. It's so much more glorious. What the reason to come back down would be purpose-driven, which I said.
How do you get back there? Yeah, you want to be back there.
Exactly. So then talk about
but in the body. Yeah.
Exactly. So then your pursuit of meditation became an obsession.
My 18th birthday, exactly, June 28th, 1973, I learned meditation. And because I had just had this samadhi or whatever experience you want to call it, I sat with my meditation teacher and completely transcended into pure consciousness and cosmic consciousness. And of course, he's there going, he could tell. And so I became his teacher, actually, after that.
And Louise Hay, who is, by the way, one of my friends.
And Louise Hay, yes, she came to my classes and things, but she was much older than I was at the time. But so this was a very exciting, period of discovery for me. And so I began to study the ancient Vedas and Sanskrit and other traditions, because I was raised in a pretty much atheist family. We didn't believe in anything. I mean, we didn't, my parents were, if it didn't fit in a test tube, it doesn't exist sort of people. So, I began to discover the whole spirituality and consciousness. And I sort of made a distinction between organized religion and constructs and pure spiritual knowledge. So I began to distinguish,
as an astrologer, the Vedic system, because that is the Kali Yuga and it is part of our system, though I do Western astrology. But I want to acknowledge this is a timeless language where words in Sanskrit have vibrations and incredible impact. And the fact that that was what called you to do puja and to create a lineage that is timeless and includes astrology of, they do 24,000 years for a Kali Yuga, for a cycle.
Well, actually, we're in a new, let's say, overarching cosmic cycle that's 500,000 years. So what people don't understand is there are cycles within cycles, but there are these giant ones. So we're at that crossroads of the closing of the old cycle, but an opening of not just a minor, but a meta cycle.
Is that why the phone just rang? Because did you hear the ringing? Because we are truly at this major transitional phase, which is why you and I are sitting and why this podcast exists and why we're staring at a computer and why we're operating with an entirely different level of consciousness. So here he becomes entering into the level first of choosing to be here by his own out-of-body experience, then actively choosing to use meditation and a lineage to hold him on the physical form called this Vedic system. And then he enters into the medical world. This is where it gets funny. So then you decide to be a doctor and play mainstream where there's crisis ongoing in the emergency room, where you are witnessing human dilemma at its worst form.
Yeah. Well, I discovered once I started, my first daughter, my wife and I met in Israel. My first daughter was born in Haifa, and we thought, well, I was over there volunteering and she was there for a conference, and I had met her in a dream. So I had 5 nights in a row where I met her in a dream. I was only 22. Of course, 22-year-old boy is no more interested in being married than man in the moon. But this enlightened master came to me literally and said, this is who you should marry. And I told my friend I was with, I said, this is crazy, but I'm going to look for this woman. So we met. She came. She didn't know about this dream. And she was like 30 or something. I was 22 or 29. And had been given all this information about her. Where she'd be coming from, she'd be older, this, that, and the other thing. And, but once I started having kids, I decided, I need to do something besides being an itinerant meditation teacher. I always loved science and biology and healing. And so I decided to go to med school, but then I decided, I don't know if I could have dealt with people who were just ate poorly and didn't exercise and had chronic diseases of their own making. So I decided, that sounds not compassionate, I'm just saying my own view, I'm being honest. I'm a blunt, very honest person. And so then I said, well, I want to do things where, like, if you've just been run over by a car or shot through the chest, that's not the time for crystals and this and that, although I do meditation in the ER. And so I decided to go into emergency and trauma, where you're on the front line of saving lives, like right now.
And he had 4 children.
And 4 children. I had 3 kids in med school, which was a tough lift, heavy lift there.
Just slow down a little bit because I'm going to pull up your chart at this point. And I just want
to. There are 4 daughters, by the way. They're all girls.
Oh,
I'm the only man in a family of 10 women.
That's so amazing. Okay, here we go. Here comes the chart. We're going to just pull this up.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's way past my pay grade, honey.
Okay, that's where I come in. So give me a minute. So here we have his birth date. The time was estimated because he wasn't 100% sure. But what we know in astrology is that these planets, no matter what time of the day, we're all standing together. So let me just speak to this. First, I'm going to talk about this. Your Mercury, the guy with the hat on the head, is in Gemini, which is the natural placement. It tells me that your communication skill, which has been so stand out in everything I've watched of you, and by the way, I'm a Gemini, it's one of my skills, is that you have the succinct way that your mind works, which is very linear, very logical, and very quick. So when other people are slowing down and they're repeating, you're like, oh my God, did we already do this? But when you're learning something, your retention and your ability to retain detail is extreme. So there's first thing, it's standing next to Venus. It's an art form for you to use your words to take us onto this mission-driven vision that you have, which I'm going to certainly support. But I just want to speak to 2 planets in Gemini. Then you have, this is the planet Uranus. I just love saying it. It looks like a TV antenna. And it rules other worlds. It rules Aquarius, the same flavor I was speaking to earlier. And when you were born, you had 3 planets all standing together, sandwiching this planet of the rebel, the adventure that goes beyond logic through what means. It's in Cancer, through his intuition, his tummy, his silence, and his unbelievable non-linear logic, which is so different than Mr. Logic over here, talking. This is the silent, intuitive, internal dad energy that wants nothing more than to take care of us.
Right.
Am I right or am I right?
You're correct. Yeah.
And then comes, this is where I really want to stand out. This only happens once a month for a few hours. Here's the moon. You can see the moon. It was standing right next to this tuning fork, which is Neptune. This is the planet of, they found this when they in the 1890s, when they found cameras that they could take pictures of things and create another reality. The same reason they made movies, to take us into an alternate world where if I say Toto, you'll think about a little white dog. It's all your imagination, but it's conjured up by Neptune, which is the visionary mystic who sees beyond the veil. But your moon, your emotional body, has access to dreams that told you who your wife would be. And it's perfectly in relationship to this Mercury in Gemini. Now, I'm going to stop there because who cares about astrology? That would be just me and a few other people in the room. I don't want to take us too far away, except to say to you, your chart is built to be an intellectual mind with a deep intuition and an access to the dream time that is driven by a mission.
Right. And that's most of everything important in my life I've seen before in dreams. Now, interestingly, my dad was half Cherokee, Native American, and that's very strong in that tradition, just like in the Aboriginals in Australia, where they have dream time. But I've always had these very clear, lucid dreams where it's knowledge, and you can absolutely, I know it's something real. That's why I acted on, and by the way, my wife and I, who met in this dream that I was shown, we're having in a couple of weeks our 43rd anniversary. But so that's sort of what, I follow that intuition. And then same thing in the emergency department. I could feel and see a cancer that was hidden in somebody's brain and would order a CAT scan, which now the fascists in the medical system wouldn't let me do it. But I would just turn to the nurse and say, just do it. And we'd get it, and there would be a tumor just where I felt it. And so I've always acted on, if I get a clear reading, vision, so it's sort of like the CIA remote viewing, but I do it through a spiritual tradition, that I've been like that since I was a little boy.
So this leads us to such an important conversation. There are beings on the planet, and some of you are watching this right now, this podcast, and certainly both of us, who have been given a mission and come with a superpower pack of special skill sets that would allow us to facilitate the mission. There's a lot of you that don't have that. There's no comparison. There's function. And in this case, Dr. Stephen Greer clearly was given a directive, and he accepted, And we are now here to celebrate what the message and the purpose of this podcast, and really, for me, honestly, my whole lifetime. Because as an astrologer, my job is to help people fall in love with themselves so they can recalibrate their own internal process as a therapist, so that I can facilitate them being of service to the intergalactic larger picture. Now, I don't tell people that. You've made it safe for me to say it. I played normal and straight for my entire career, and I'm also like you in my mid-60s. So it's been a secret, and I'm kind of coming out in this interview that I have, in no uncertain terms, known that the function of this time in this planet is that we're in this transition as described by these 500,000 year cycles. Nothing's wrong, except there's the variable of the human not listening. And this is where you come back. So one of the questions I ask everyone in my podcast is, what would you like to change about people? So if you could fill in this blank, I wish people were, what would you say? I wish people
would take a quiet time to discover who they are and to open up their inner light of consciousness and meditative capabilities, because that is how you get guidance, and that is how you awaken to your true self, your mission, your purpose, your raison d'etre in life. And I think that everyone in our frenetic, hyper speed society, we're not taking the time to do that for ourselves, which is one of the things we're going to do at this retreat. We're going to do every night a long meditation, puja, teaching people meditation techniques, and do that, and then use those techniques to make contact with these interstellar civilizations. Now, something I didn't mention is that there's a whole physics of that. There's a science of consciousness, but there's also trans-dimensional physics, where interstellar civilizations that go faster than the speed of light have technologies that interface with very coherent thought and very directed, intentional thought and consciousness. So you're going to see my intellect sort of trying to expiate and explain something very abstract. But imagine, well, Elon Musk is working on this, where you could actually think to this phone. You don't have to touch it or speak to it. The thought, it's the quanta of thought cause it to actuate and do things. That's what interstellar civilizations have. So that's why the core operating system of the CE5 contact, which is what we teach in the app, this app we have, is the meditative capability that then combines with the ability to see, be a seer, and then make contact using very coherent thought and intentionality to invite these people to join us in this effort to create a new universe. It's not, so here's another mistake. People think we're in a global cycle. No, this is a universal cycle, very different. You cannot judge anything that we have in the historical record of the past with what's going to be unfolding very quickly in the future, because we're actually in a universal cycle that involves the Earth and all these other planetary systems outside our solar system.
So I just want to slow it down a little bit, Mr. Mercury and Gemini, and just back into the human who can't sit still. So as a therapist of 40 some years, what I see in the nature of the unconscious mind is there's a split between the mind that is listening to you and retaining information and fascinated, and then the resistance and the gremlins and the interruption and the static that keeps us as far away from listening.
Yes.
And there's a war. There's an invisible war that exists in the human psyche that I imagine is going on intergalactically. And yet there is the ability through the pujas, through the temples, through the prayers, through the meditation, through the ones up in Tibet that have learned how to take that duality and bring it into stillness.
Right. And that can be done many different, I liken it to, if this state of samadhi and pure conscious and peace that's within everyone, because the nature of the mind is that it's infinite. Your mind, my mind. And so I tell people, if there are 8 billion people on the planet, there are 8 billion spokes going into the hub of the wheel of life. That is this unbounded field of consciousness. So everyone has to actually discover their own spoke, their own path.
That's my job.
Yeah. So that's what's beautiful.
So this is, I want to just hitchhike here. As an astrologer, my function to your audience and the people that you play with is to help them facilitate their unique, that particular brand and strand, so they can get really comfortable in their skin and then lean into their spiritual self. So I talk about the split between the ego mind, who's so insecure and so scared and so believes we're doomed. We're doomed. The collective voice in our planet right now is, hey, we're totally out of here. And then the higher level, where you and I are trying to support us, to give us a ladder, to show us how to get to that access so that we can become this unified field. So I want to return for a moment to the static. It is because I have done unbelievable research. How this podcast began was my concern for the climate.
Yes. Right.
So as I began to say, we are going straight to a brick wall. And the more research I did, including the documentary that won the best documentary there, Chasing Coral, Jeff Berlowski was my first interview. Chasing Coral, in no uncertain terms, let us know the ecosystem of water, which is what you've mastered. So let me distinguish it. Your explanation of stillness, of meditation, of the samadhi state is clean water. Being still, allowing the impression from above to reflect clearly and remind us all is okay. But the dirty water under our system, which has been toxified to the point now where it's going to be destroyed, we put it in plastic bottles, we can't drink, we don't know how to meditate from a place of stillness, because immediately when we close our eyes, the internal dialogue starts to go with waves and static and fear. So I'd like to hear from you, what has allowed you to find the stillness and the peace that lives inside of you?
I actually began to experiment with that as a child. And because I think, there's maybe some psychological reasons for that, having been raised the way we were. We were beaten, starved, neglected, left on the street. You will never hear a worse story. When I saw Mommy Dearest, I thought that would have been the nicest day of our childhood. So I think that it induced me to find a place within where you could have that peace, only to survive even.
Okay, can we talk about that?
So that was a very interesting thing that happened.
You've used the pain body. This is so interesting as my point of view. You've used the pain body as leverage because you went into pain.
Mm-hmm. The suffering, yeah. And so that's the mystery of suffering if you use it wisely, which somehow I was able to do. But I think that for many people, when I've done many, many years of teaching people meditation, I always tell people you have to first understand, have the knowledge of this. What is this conscious field? What is this inner state? And then understand that you may have to adopt and adapt any technique to your uniqueness. I have a good friend who's a internal medicine doctor in Los Angeles who plays the harp. And she would get into that state of consciousness through the motion of the harp and the tones that she would create. And she would get into this expanded state of pure bliss and expanded mind. I can go on a 30-mile mountain bike ride and get into a rhythm, whereas I'm biking, I get into that state. So a lot of people think it can only happen when you're sitting quietly and doing nothing, which is a very good thing to practice, but it can also unfold once you understand it, even while you're in the midst of certain kinds of action where you get into what psychologists call flow consciousness.
So this is so perfect because you're supporting astrology. Everyone has a unique doorway to get to the stillness, and that the quality of pain, you really address your childhood. The exact thing that so many people watching this suffered from in varying degrees. Clearly, you had a very, very painful beginning, as did I. And yet it was leveraged to bring you into a state that gave you permission to take your stillness as your holy land. Like, where is that place? How do I get back? So in the other worlds, this is what I watched the final 3 versions of Gaia, which I was just on last week. They interviewed me, but I watched your 3 final interviews, and you talked about the levels of consciousness, and that there's a God consciousness, and that there's a hope. This is what you did. You changed my entire psychology and my whole framework when I realized, of course, there's higher. Please tell me this is not the only place to be, and please tell me we are the lowest level, and this is very immature, and we're a little childlike. And that's what you told me.
Right, and we're emerging. See, what people need to understand, it's like an individual human is born in infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. In an ideal way, they would mature and unfold. Well, as a species, humans, Homo sapiens, we've gone through our childhood and infancy But we're now in sort of a rambunctious adolescence that's pretty dangerous, because the boys with their toys and nuclear weapons and all this, and boys will be boys. But ultimately, then, we have to make it through to maturity. The hallmark of maturity is not just world peace, but universal peace. And I point out to people, because we're not alone in the universe, because we're being visited by multiple different intelligent civilizations, none of whom are hostile, but are all concerned with what we're doing to the earth and nuclear weapons and radiation in the oceans and what have you. We have to understand that we're not just having the challenge of creating peace on Earth. We can't have peace on Earth and then war in space, which is what the Space Force is all about, and all that warmongering that's going on. The whole thing that's happening that I'm working on in Washington is to move the US government away from a false disclosure that pivots all of humanity in a conflict in space to a period where we embrace all of life in the cosmos, and in a state of higher consciousness and enlightenment, create a world on Earth that over the next 1,000 years will be fully integrated into other planetary civilizations. And we will, in fact, be extraterrestrials to other planets. So that's what's happening. That's the process.
I'm so excited. But now I have two questions. I want to come to what I recently heard about Washington having some new legal possibilities, because here we are with Saturn and Aquarius again. There's an opportunity astrologically for some opening. But when we come back to the abductions, because there is a negative track around the ET conversation, and there is put into the unconscious, as always, because that's what humans do. They like to scare the shit out of themselves.
Of course, I know all the people who have been doing this. So what people have to understand is, if something is happening that certain sectors of the intelligence community can't control, they will then simulate that event so they can control the narrative. In this case, beginning in the 50s and 60s, they began to develop technologies of man-made looking UFOs and the ability to abduct people, humans. So it's humans abducting humans, humans mutilating cattle and horses, simulating ETs. Now, I discovered this in 92, 93, 94.
When Saturn was Aquarius.
Yes, and that was when I got pulled into briefing the CIA director and all these people. And what I realized was that there was a very sophisticated and rather dark part of the Black project world, the unacknowledged special access projects that were sort of beyond Black. Now, I can't say too much in a public forum, but I will just say that in the last year, I have been providing actual intelligence to the key people the last 8 months in Washington, who have now penetrated those projects, who are discovering that everything I just said is true. So there is a huge change happening, and we've created a pathway for exonerating people from their national security oaths and non-disclosure agreements to come forward as witnesses. And we're asking people to contact me, because I'm a conduit between the one part of the world and the government. Now, a lot of people don't realize, I've worked with people over the years who manage the Black budget of the United States, the chairman of, intelligence committees, other committees, White House, National Security Council, admirals, generals. All those people were denied access to these projects. So you have to say, well, who's running these projects? Well, I know who they are.
That was my next question. Who's behind the curtain?
Oh, yes, the metaphorical Wizard of Oz, pulling all the strings, carrying the hell out of people. And that is actually what it is. It's a bunch of these old guys who want to maintain control over the world that's slipping out of their grip, who want to be able to pivot the world instead of the Cold War and one nation state against another. They want to create a boogeyman in space. This is why they're staging and hoaxing abductions and mutilations. I actually have multiple people on my team who are military guys who've been on man-made UFOs doing the abductions. And we have a CIA document that describes, in 1985, abductions being done by the CIA in Argentina and Brazil. That Jacques Vallée has this document, by the way,
Yes,
Dr. Vallée.
I totally, so let me just put this in layman's terms. There is an influence in the collective brought to us by the government that has not our best interest in mind, and it's to support a system that keeps the money in the hands of the power
But
mongers.
there's a fine point here that's not correct in what you said. It's
Okay.
very important. When people say the government, they think of the president, the Senate, the House, the Pentagon. Okay, so there are two governments. And this it's exactly what Senator Inouye said during Iran-Contra. When Senator Inouye from Hawaii said, there exists a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism that's above the law and free from the law itself, I'm quoting. So I think people have to, they have to be very careful not to conflate all this stuff happening. Because when people say, oh, well, the US government or the British government are doing, I said, look, I routinely in Washington, where I have a place, meet with the most senior people in the United States government, and they don't know anything about this issue. And the people running it are in these deep, black, clandestine projects, and much of it is corporate. Much of it is sitting in.
It's all based on the money. So that's just, thank you for that distinction. What I want to ask in the name of the future, because I have, having watched your stuff and done my own meditation, all of a sudden I felt optimistic. Because when you hear that, when you hear what you just said about the black, and I hate calling it the black government because even that word is wrong. When you hear about this dark behind the scenes government that's beyond law, when you hear about the environment going to a crash landing where suddenly there's no support about the water and the fish and Jeff Orlowski.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We lose hope. And here's where the hope lies, said the astrologer to the one that knows how to meditate into peace. There is another reality that's calling our name. And until we as a collective, and this is back to your message, gather together and unify the field, which is why I'm coming to Arizona, inviting all my audience, until we come together and actually change the frequency and calibrate with the future, said the astrologer. How do I get you into the future? I bring you into the now.
Exactly.
And use the noise of this unbelievable story that you are so articulate about. So invitation into the now. All of this means, one, you discover your own nature so you can get yourself into your own unique strand of what your way of meditating is. No one's here to tell you how to do that. You'll find it with the curiosity and the sincerity of being really willing. That's what I just did with your work. I took such a dive. I do notice about my personality type, because I'm a Gemini, that my intellectual appetite is absolutely insatiable. When I hear the truth, and this is really what I want to distinguish, that there's a long view. And when you put the teenage energy of the human into context of the mature one, you don't get mad at your teenage kid for crashing the car. Well, you get mad, but you take the keys away and you give a consequence and you say, kid, I got to teach you something. You don't get mad when sexuality on our planet is completely out of control. That's a teenager that has no longer respect for the physical. We are teenagers, but we cannot continue to judge and make this wrong. So what is the voice of compassion that you would lay on the human condition?
Yeah, well, I would say that we have to be, one of the things I've said to even these folks I work with is that a scorched earth policy, an eye for an eye, leaves the whole world blind. We're going to have to.
Say it again slower, Mr. Gemini. Do that once more.
I said an eye for an eye leaves the entire world blind. That at a certain point, we have to have compassion, but also forgiveness. One of the great lessons I learned from my childhood was to forgive my parents. My sisters never did. But I forgave them when I was a teenager and then became the son that helped them. So I think that we have to turn to, like even these folks who have been misguided doing these things, we have to be firm, but we have to have the ability to forgive them if they rectify their course. Now, I am advising these folks that I work with, the senior folks in the government, that we start issuing subpoenas and that they are going to be required to come forward. I know who all of them are.
And it's safe zone. That's what I heard you say. So they're no longer going to be charged or guilty or.
Right, exactly. There will be an amnesty period. But then at a certain point, if they continue to do the things they're doing, then we can bring treason charges.
And this is the first time that the government allowed you to have this possibility?
Yeah. Yes. I've been working with folks at that level since 92 and 3. And in the last
Stop. 1992 and 93, Saturn was in Aquarius. 2021 and 22, Saturn's in Aquarius. Every 30 years that you've described, starting with the 60s to the 90s to now, the astrological influence is on your team. I just want to say,
the biggest interstellar craft in our solar system is out by the rings of Saturn, by the way.
my favorite planet.
Yeah. I had an executive with the Lockheed Martin, and they had the contract for the Cassini probe. And he calls me up and says, "Hey, doctor, we've imaged this massive object out by the rings of Saturn. And we're talking dozens to hundreds of miles in diameter. Huge. I know a 4-star general that when he saw it turned white. Because here's what, one of the things I said to the head of Army Intelligence when he threatened my life, and then he offered $2 billion, tried to bribe me in 1992. And I said, no, I'm not interested in your money. I don't need it, and not interested. And I said, you have your plan, but there's another plan. And I pointed to the heavens, and it's a divine plan. It's a cosmic plan. It's an interstellar plan. And I will tell you right now which plan ultimately will prevail, notwithstanding all this buffoonery. And he just looked at me. He crossed his arms, this white-haired guy. And I'm like, a 30-some-year-old doctor. And he turns to his NSA and CIA guys who were there. We know exactly who this son of a bitch is, like that. I said, well, yes. So the other part of me is that I'm very much a warrior. It's like I do not get rocked back. It's like it's just part of
story that
it's part of my nature.
He threatened you with your life, and you were like, "I've already died. I'm not scared."
Mm-hmm. Yes, I said, make my day. I said, I hate to sound like Clint Eastwood, but it's like I've been on that. It's like gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's enlightenment, it's peace. I don't have a death wish, but and I do take security precautions, and when my team has to. But
and I wanted to,
by the way, we do ask for people's prayer and meditation for protection. The folks, I cannot talk about the details. The folks I'm working with are in lethal danger with what's been going on the last few months. I am. We are hitting pay dirt. They are getting inside these systems, and it will never be in the media, the details of this, but the top people in Washington know. And so, but it's also very, very, very dangerous right now, like really dangerers. So like I haven't seen since in my own life since the 90s. Mm-hmm.
But wasn't there a death of someone on your team, and didn't you get cancer at one point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 3 of us got metastatic cancer the same month. And then the former director of the CIA, who was helping me after he had retired, he was going to go hand over one of these free energy devices that would have saved the planet in 1995, I think. And that was CIA Director Colby. And they found him floating down the south of Washington in the river, and they had killed him. So we went through some terribly dangerous things between 94 and 97. But that's been better. But right now, because of the pace of what's happening, the folks who have these technologies and this information are ruthless. And I'm, I hate to say it. I told Will Smith's people were meeting with me. I said, I'll tell you who Enemy of the State is. It's me. But the guy who wrote Enemy of the State, David Marconi, he wrote that movie, and he's the one who took the picture of that ET who healed that man of his hearing. If you look at the movie, that was David Marconi, who wrote Enemy of the State, ironically, about the National Security Agency. By the way, we're going to be going up to Oracle with a small group again the week before Wekopa, the Native American place where we're having this event.
I want to hitchhike on this last piece. Your life lesson in astrology, Saturn, in my system, the way I teach, is the most important planet. And it describes to us on Earth, it rules bones and governments and teeth and structures and buildings. It's very, very, it's like the hard part about reality on this plane. And it tells me what the person came to learn. What's so interesting, I find is so crazy, is your Saturn. I'm going to just pull it up again for those of my astrology buffs. You have Saturn when you were born in Scorpio. And Scorpio is a sign of the dark. It is the unconscious mind that rules death and the fearlessness of death, but also the dark world of the unconscious mind, where everything from your family lurks, how to really deprive and to hurt. And so your life
Mhm.
lesson is, and so beautifully aspected in your case with these blue lines, is that you can face the dark, the scary parts. The fear of death is not a conversation for you, because this is the highest road you're displaying, the highest road of Saturn and Scorpio. Try it. There's nothing for me to be
Yeah.
scared of. So I want to ask you, you've stood face to face with evil. It's very clear this is what evil is, the attempt to take away the free energy, to take away the unified field that will bring us into a universal experience of peace. There's some energetic attempt by energy that I always say there's an invisible war that lives outside of us, that lives between the two brains, that lives between the dark and the light. And yet your life lesson, Saturn and Scorpio, is like, you're like, come on, stand face to face with me. Light is not going to be overcome by dark. So can you speak to that, the whole energetic of your relationship with that conversation?
For me, it's a really simple one. And that is, if it's very dark, if you light one candle, there's no more dark. So what most people do, and this is the trick, they get pulled into these dark conversations and then they obsess on it, and then that becomes part of them. What I do is, it's okay to be aware of it. You need to know that you could have a head-on collision on the freeway, but you're actually wanting to connect to this higher self, this higher consciousness. And when you're doing that, then you're in that light, and in that light there is no darkness. You can be aware of it. So what people, that you have to add that other ingredient, and if you just light one candle, there is no darkness. But so I view a lot of this stuff, with all these characters I've had to deal with, and some of them are very lethal and dark folks, is a gnat flying in front of the sun. Not that I'm the sun, but the truth of all this is the sun. So I go, okay, I just put them in that perspective, so I don't give them any more power than they should deserve, because it's really pathetic. Because remember, there's been studies that have been done about the difference between force and power, true power. And force is the inverse, proportionally less than power. True power comes from within. When you force something, that's actually very weak. So it's like a bully ultimately is a very weak person, an insecure person. Well, this kind of darkness is actually very weak, but people ascribe to it and give it power it really doesn't have, because they just need to have that added ingredient, light, the light of consciousness, the light of truth, the light of optimism, love. My life, I'm very affectionate, loving, I'm sort of an alpha male that's very loving. Yeah.
You know that Cancer is the most emotional sign in the zodiac?
Oh, yeah. I'm very emotional, actually. People know me, but, I just have always been that way, and I'm not,
No, that's just your nature. Here's the other thing. You're going to laugh when I tell you this. In your chart, there's 4 elements. The entire system down here on planet Earth is 4 elements: water, air, earth, and fire. And water is the compassionate sensitivity that you carry. Air is what we talked about, your intellectual speed. Fire is your enthusiasm that can't get stopped, Mr. Athlete. But the missing element in your chart that you have 0 planets on is Earth. You have 0 planets on Earth in your chart.
Well, that's why my wife, whose soulmate, is known as Earth Mother. She's like the quintessential Earth Mother if everyone lives. So there you go.
So it's always interesting that we draw to us, and clearly the destiny of the soulmate was clearly in Earth, and I bet that she's got lots of Earth in her chart, which I'd love to meet her and see her chart. So this conversation, the highlight I want to point at is the long view, said the astrologer. The long view, said the Kali Yuga, said the long view, said the 500,000 year, letting us get off the simple fear of the here and now, which is real. Like you can't, the handicap of the human is our fixation. There's something about the human brain that can't tolerate long view.
Well, I think that's also a type of meditative state where we instead of dwelling on the negative, you look to the near horizon and even the far horizon, and you let your soul be focused on that, because that optimism and hope manifest that future as opposed to being so negative. And I tell people, one of the things we're working on right now, which we haven't announced publicly, I guess I'll mention it here, is that we're going to do another feature film like Unacknowledged and Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. And it'll be about all these sciences and technologies that can save the planet within a decade or two. And we're going to call it the Lost Century, where we pull the curtain back on 100 years of these lost technologies, but we're going to feature ones that have existed and some that do exist now that need to be brought forward. And how do we bring them forward so that we create a new world? Because I always remind people that beautiful story when Colonel Corso, who wrote the Day After Roswell, had this meeting with an ET out at White Sands where we detonated all the hydrogen and atomic bombs. And, he was this brash Air Force colonel and a young guy. This is 1956, 1 year after I was born. And this ET craft comes in and lands, and it materializes and then dematerializes, and it goes back and forth. Finally, it stays. This ET comes out, and he has this meeting with this ET, and it's all very telepathic. And the ET is asking him to stop targeting their craft and stop doing these atomic and nuclear weapons. And Colonel Corso goes, "What's in it for me?" And the ET says, "A new world, if you can take it." So what I'm telling people is that since before I was born, we could have had a new world without pollution, poverty, the oceans, earth pristine, and poverty totally eliminated off the planet before I was born. And the only way that's going to happen, those who have great power aren't going to do it. It's like I grew up in the South, and I had an African-American girlfriend in high school and almost got run over and killed by a car because of the racists who hated that I had a Black girlfriend. And now I have a wife who's Jewish. You can imagine. I don't know what these racists would say now, but say bug off. But so what I found was that people think that came from the top down. No, the Kennedy brothers were actually resisting the civil rights movement. It was this small group of people, Martin Luther King and others, a gay Black man named Baird Rustin, who was the brains behind the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. All these people, and they took risk, and they started this mass consciousness change. And all that changed in my lifetime from when I was a little kid to now. I remember segregated Black and white water fountains at the little store my father worked in. I'm old enough to remember that. I hate to admit it. I'm 67. I just turned 67 in June. So I tell people, these big changes, and this is the biggest one yet. The one we're talking about is the granddaddy of them all. That has to have the engagement of the masses, which is why we're doing the Disclosure Project and these feature films and this gathering in Arizona on September 16th, 17th, and 18th, because we want to have a mass consciousness meditation with people online, because you can be there all weekend online if you can't be there in person, because only a few hundred people can be there in person. But that causes this change in the morphogenic field, in the conscious field. And that's how you ignite a positive change. It's not the top down, although I deal with people in Washington and other places. It's really I've always said, if the people will lead, the leaders will follow. And that's what happened with civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, all this. It all was the people doing it. And that's what we have to own. We have to become less passive and more actuated. We have to embrace this change, and we have to be agents of that change. And that's the responsibility each soul has, as I see it.
It's so beautiful. So there's a technology. What I heard from your interviews is it's already in place, this free energy, the ability to the nonlinear moving in and out of time, being able to create an entirely different structure around our energy system, yes. Carbon. Can you speak to that a little bit? Like, it's already in place, but it's been kept secret because of, back to the conversation of these beings who don't want to have to share the wealth and change the infrastructure of our society. Is that correct?
Correct. Now, let me just think for a moment. There's something like 900 trillion in assets tied up in fossil fuels, public utilities, surface roads. All of that's obsolete. So we're talking the largest macroeconomic and scientific and sociological change in recorded history by orders of magnitude. So because of that, they would rather maintain the status quo, even if it kills the earth, right? It's crazy. Because many of the people I deal with now, they weren't alive when those decisions were made. Those decisions were made before they were even thought of and born. And so, but they've inherited a situation where in the 20s, when Nikola Tesla was around, we only had 2.5 billion people on the planet. Now we have 8. And of those 2.5 billion people, only a handful had electricity in cars. Now there are 1 billion motor vehicles on the road, 1.5 billion, 1.5 billion motor vehicles. There are 2.3 billion homes with electricity and using gas and fossil fuels and coal. This isn't sustainable. So we should have made, this is why I call this the lost century. There's a century of social, spiritual, and technological scientific evolution that's been lost. We need to do what I call a time snap, where we bring those technologies out and develop a very wise, thought through plan to bring it forward so that in 10 to 20 years, we're not using any of those technologies. And by the way, we're also not using solar or wind because those are way inadequate. Exactly. I own the largest solar farm in Virginia. I'm looking at it right here. And I can tell you, when the power goes out here, it won't run a fraction of this house. And it's the largest legally allowed solar farm in the state of Virginia. So we're going to have to bring out this new physics. We understand it. I'm working with people who built these devices, but a lot of those folks have had their devices confiscated. People have been murdered. People have been falsely imprisoned. So how do you get these technologies out? You need to have 1 billion people behind the disclosure of one of those technologies. That's what we're doing next, because that's how you save the biosphere. But it's got to be, it's not going to just be some obscure group of scientists that do this by themselves. It has to have a mass movement of people behind it who care about the earth.
I am just going to say I'm on your team. I have an audience. It's not large. It's large. It's growing like crazy. And it's because I, as an astrologer, have seen the future. I always make a joke, it's 60 miles east of here, but I've seen the future. There's 2 paths. I want to just speak to it because it's hard to hear. On one path, we do make this transition, and there's a beautiful ending of beings who actually show up with the spiritual wisdom to start listening to the higher levels of intelligence that have been waiting to help us, but they get scared when they watch films like E.T. They get scared when they hear that we're going to hurt them. When this, that story of the 50s of how we took apart these beings, and so there's a fear factor. And that part must be diminished by us being, and me, I'm speaking to myself, stop being so scared to admit that I have a relationship, what I haven't gone public yet to tell, but I will tell you when we're alone, that I've had a direct experience. So there's no way that I can deny in my own psyche that I'm part of a team who's trying to set up a future where the planet will return to equanimity, because there's enough of us, the 1 billion people, who take the power back. The bad guys are coordinated. Why can't the good guys be coordinated? Now let's go to the other side to the story. What if it doesn't happen?
Well, it's like the Hopi prophecy, where the prophecy line, there are 2. One, there's a terminus and it ends. And the other, it kind of goes up. Okay. So this is, again, on a planet of free will, we can choose one or the other. And this is an individual and collective choice. So far, we've made not the correct choices in the last 50 to 100 years, collectively. Now that can change. Now, even if it doesn't, I call that the Phoenix scenario, ironically, since we'll be here in Phoenix and next month doing this. Yeah, exactly. Huico Pass, a Native American land that we'll be on. And what I tell people is that even if you were to hit that terminus, like boom, it's like a shutdown. But out of that, a phoenix will rise. How would that phoenix? Okay, but how does that phoenix rise? It's because we've sown enough seeds to collectively create the phoenix. So I tell people, this is such a complex set of fractals and things and powers that I am convinced that whether we make this transition that's bumpy and take off, or whether there's a short-term, let's call it hiatus and pause, we're going to make it across the chasm to a new world, a new civilization that's interstellar, enlightened, peaceful, abundant. Because with these technologies that I'm talking about, there'd be not only no poverty in the world, there'd be no shortage of anything. Because if you understand interstellar manufacturing, they don't dig up metals to make a spacecraft. They create a resonant field in a trans-dimensional energy field where it pops into 3D materialization. So we're talking about a future.
We have that technology yet?
Yeah, they figured out a lot of it. Yeah.
Field that creates metal.
Oh, sure. And you can also transmute. So you can put a type of metal in a type of microwave energy with some other minerals, and you can take a tin can and turn it into platinum or gold. I have a CIA document. I actually have a computer disk with several hundred pages of confiscated patents that deal with this sort of thing in my own possession. So,
I'm so excited.
I know it's mind-blowing stuff. We don't have time to go into all of it. But what I'm saying is, whatever you've heard me say is the tip of the iceberg of where our civilization could be and should be. But once we resolve this issue and this starts coming out, if we use, now here's the if, this is the giant cosmic if, all those sciences and technologies have to be used for peaceful, mutually beneficial purposes. If they are bent to the objectives of war and conflict, that's very dangerous. So this also gets to be a collective consciousness question. Do we want to move forward? Yes, no, yes. Okay, then the only path forward, ironically, is universal peace. Because if you have these advanced technologies that can save the planet, but the consciousness of division and hatred and war is still the prevailing paradigm, which it is right now, then those technologies will be bent to the purpose of conflict. Right. And those technologies are orders of magnitude more powerful than nuclear. So how do you go forward? You can only go forward where you move consciousness, universal peace, social development, and these technologies all together. It all has to be synced up in the perfect synchronization.
Do you feel like there's a large enough team, or, I mean, first of all, how can we help individually? And then do you feel like there is the good guys getting coordinated?
Yes, they are. It's certainly a David and Goliath story, but of the underdogs. But remember that the entire legal constitutional government of the United States has a tiny fraction of the power and technologies of the secret government. And I'll just tell you, to give you an idea, just put reality to this. I don't know if you can imagine, I'm briefing the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Wilson. And I have astronaut Edgar Mitchell with me, who started Noetic Sciences. And I'm bringing him in just to educate him. And it's a stand-up briefing at the Pentagon. And at the end of the meeting, I say, look, we really need your help getting these technologies and these operations that are deep black, illegal, under control. And he said, the best thing I know that I can use is a B-2 stealth bomber. And what I've learned from the information and the documents you've given me, and he later confirmed it in real time inside the system, is that this secret government program have technologies that can do circles around my B-2 stealth. So he said, it's point, set, match. I'm outgunned, I'm outmanned. And I said, but you cannot think that way. And he says, well, even if I wanted to do what you're suggesting, I would have to have the authorization of the Secretary of Defense and the President. I said, well, no, I've already briefed them. They're not going to touch this. They're afraid for their lives. And he says, well, that's it. So it was very interesting. Now, the difference now is that the Congress has passed a bill mandating that they get to the bottom of this. And even though it's not in the media or on the internet, the people who are actually getting into it, that I'm providing information to, that's really happening, like I haven't seen in 32 years. So there's a lot happening. It's very, very exciting. But what we really need are people, it's like viral spreading the word for us, because, believe it or not, my wife and I run this whole project out of our house. We have no funding. The films are crowdfunded. This next film, we're going to ask people to crowdfund it. We have our, workshops and things, and people have a tuition, but it gets spent doing this. For example, all this work I'm doing for providing archives and information to the government is pro bono. They're not paying us, and I won't accept any money. If they said, here's $1 billion, I'd say, no, I don't want it. So this has to be supported by the people. So we ask people for their support, their prayers. And if you get the CE5 Contact app, it's called CE5 Contact, then practice the CE5 Contact. That potentiates this and enlivens this ocean of the future, the good future, I call it. It activates the good future. And it actually causes a change They've done studies in meditation where a certain number of people meditating in a community changes everyone in the community who don't even know that they're there meditating. It's this field effect of consciousness. So everybody can do that. And then we also ask people to help network us to, whether it's funding sources or military sources. A lot of people in their families have folks who worked on this subject who know things. They need to contact us. There are people out there who have these technologies that they've worked on that they pulled back from because they've been threatened. They need to get those to us. We'll bring them out. I'm not afraid. I mean, the worst thing they do, they kill me. I go, well, thank you very much. I'm on the other side. Adios, amigos.
Saturn and Scorpio. Just tell me that Saturn and Scorpio. Okay, can I ask you, I have a couple more questions. I feel like I could talk to you forever. Mr. Mercury and Gemini. Is there something, like, I'm curious about a couple things that we asked everyone in our podcast that I stepped over. If there was someone in history across time that you could have a conversation with, who would it be?
Probably, well, in recent times, it would be Sri Yukteswar, Yogananda's teacher.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew it was going to be a guru.
And also with Aristotle and Plato. And I would love to have a conversation with Nikola Tesla, who, of course, had these technologies and they were suppressed. By the way, my farm here in Virginia is 10 minutes from the Swananoa Institute, where Dr. Walter Russell, a fellow physician.
Walter Russell is one of my heroes.
And well, that's right here. You should come see this.
And no one knows about him. Why didn't he get left behind? He was right in your alley.
Oh, I know, but that's why he was left behind. He wrote the Universal One, but he also helped mentor Nikola Tesla. And Dr. Walter Russell had contact with the ETs, and so did Nikola Tesla. Now, I always tell people, I'm often on shows where I joke about that the Tesla car company has a Musk, because you're plugging it into a coal-fired power grid or gas. It's not a Tesla. A Tesla, let me describe a true Tesla car. It would have a little tiny battery, not 900 pounds of poisonous lithium-ion batteries, a generator motor that would be tapping into this zero-point energy field or quantum vacuum, and it would never have to be plugged in, never run out of juice, and it would have no range anxiety. That would be a true Tesla. That's what Tesla had in the 20s. And JP Morgan said, if we can't put a meter on this, it's not coming out. So that's why I talk about 100 years of lost civilizational evolution and prosperity and enlightenment and social justice, etc.
In astrology terms, that was the Piscean age. They last for 2,100 years, and the very end of it was the Piscean age is the illusion and the misconception about reality because they go off planet. And then came the Aquarian age, which is here right now, which is why we're sitting in a computer, which is now the freedom of opening up the mind to the future that includes the ET and the larger level of consciousness that includes all these beings. That my prayer, let's complete with the prayer that and I'm speaking from my own personal experience, that we can reduce our fear of the unknown because of the distinction of people not looking like us, that I can allow myself to love beyond this physical plane with my eyes closed and know that there's benevolent beings who are standing in the background waiting for us to open our hearts and find our way back to their truth and their hearts and their love and become a family again.
And if we ask, they will help us in seen and unseen ways.
And they're waiting.
And they're waiting. They've been waiting for some time. That's why we're all working on this. And I always tell people, one of the things we have to do as a species is when you look into the eyes of each other, instead of seeing the person, only the person's gender or color or whatever, see the light of consciousness. And then see that consciousness and your consciousness is a singularity. It's one. Now we have to then do that with the ETs. I do it with my dogs and with dolphins and with birds. And since a childhood, I've been like, even though I grew up in the racist South, I never cared about anyone's color or wealth. I always saw this other thing, the light of the conscious mind.
That's
So I've
Neptune.
never
Beyond the physical plane into the Neptune, the moon in Libra, the sweetness. Is there music in the celestial? Are other planets creating music?
Yes, they do. And they have their own social and cultural aspects. The other thing is, I haven't told you this story, but when I started this project in 1990, I was taken out into the solar system by some ETs. And then I was shown each planet in our solar system and heard its tonality and was introduced to its personality, because they're actually not just lumps of rock. They're conscious living entities,
no. You're
but not human.
Fire, excuse me.
And I actually heard the tones. Then I was shown the stars, and then I heard the whole cosmos that became this unbelievably gorgeous tonality that all blended into one pure note. And on that, I transcended into unity consciousness, Brahman consciousness, actually.
And so are you going to be open to me looking at your chart, you and your wife, and playing astrology and giving you the sound of the tone of the planet that's specific to you two? That would be
sure.
A yes.
I'm open to anything. I'm an open book. I'm always curious.
One last question. The altered states that occur through this unbelievable popular conversation of microdosing and ayahuasca and using these mediums to get to the source. Would you have opinion one way or the other about those doorways?
I think all doorways could be useful if they had the wisdom of the practitioner behind it. Now, so this is about wisdom. In the West, what everyone tries to do with those is to go through the McDonald's of spiritual development, the drive-through McDonald's. And what happens, it develops dependency rather than being a gateway. So I think, or a doorway to open. So I think, again, I'm not into sort of catechisms of rigidity. I'm into what is the essence of the question. And then the essence of the question, is it salutary? Is it beneficial to your spiritual development or not? Now, and unfortunately, in our culture, very few people, I don't care if they call themselves a shaman or not, have the wisdom to do those things appropriately, respectfully, in a restrained and disciplined way, et cetera, and so on and so forth. So then what happens is that then people develop an external crutch. So is it something helpful, or does it become a dependency crutch? And that's true whether it's physical, spiritual, emotional. And I tell people that's the metric. That's the question.
You're so smart. That Mercury conjunct Venus, your mind is an artist in the house of the mystic. Like, my dream would be, before I finish this podcast, if I had my dream come true, besides us unifying billions of people to support this mission, would be for you to learn astrology, because the length in your mind to put this in order, and with the exercise of discipline and brought to you by wisdom, which for me, I have a funny interpretation, the incredible gift of being so smart and dumb. How humble can I be to put my knees on the ground and say, give me the discipline, give me the wisdom, direct me from the highest source, and don't let me get the McDonald's version of anything, please.
Exactly. Although I have to say, the reason I like tonight I'll be at the gym leg pressing 900 pounds, because I like being a big dumb person. It's kind of fun.
I do yoga every day. Okay, so I can't look. We went way over. I just want you to know.
I joke a lot. I'm very off color and joke a lot. But yes, it is fun being. And because I'm from the South, you can get away with murder by being big and dumb.
Yeah, and because I'm Jewish, I really have a good sense of humor. Okay, I'm going to push this button in just a moment and stop this. We're going to continue. You and I don't go off. But please, I want you all to know the importance of this work cannot be underestimated. If there was one stop, I mean, I am eclectic, and I've researched, and through my podcast, the interesting characters. There's nothing that matters more than universal peace. And when this conversation becomes part of the collective, and we're no longer scared, and that's exactly what Dr. Stephen Greer just did. He dispelled the craziness of that other world by saying, the light will always come. Right. Just the truth.
That is, and that's what the light eliminates all darkness, even a little.
Even a little.
Thank you so much for listening. We want to keep this conversation going with you, so please subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating and review to make sure you never miss an episode. Remember, climate activist by day, human by night. Send Debra a DM on Instagram at Debra Silverman Astrology and visit DebraSilvermanAstrology.com. And we're going to leave you like we leave every single episode. Make it your mission to change the world.